All right. All right. Please, we're going to go ahead and get started again. Oh, buddy, yeah. Thank you. All right. So this last module for today is going to be around assessments. I'll go ahead and disappoint you all now before we get too far into this. I'm not going to have a lot of great answers for I think a lot of the concerns that we have around assessment. I want to talk about a few strategies for ways to maybe modify our approaches to think differently about what we're assessing and how we're assessing. But at the end of the day, some of that is not going to address the fundamental question of like, how do I know that a student did this work? Those are going to be very difficult questions. So instead, what we're going to talk about will be a few different ideas and different kinds of strategies to take with your assessment. There'll be a number of worksheets and templates and things for you all to consider using in the future. A little bit about thinking about rubrics if you're trying to assess student work, and specifically like process-oriented work. And at the end, there's an activity that's kind of more around thinking about ways that you might use AI to help you in different aspects of assessment. So designing parts of assessment, designing supplemental material to give to students as parts of assessment, things like that, okay? So that's the plan. If you, let's see if I can do this correctly. All right, so as usual, this QR code is just going to take you to that modules folder. So in theory, you probably already have this pulled up at this point. But in that module 8 folder, there are a couple different things, more than a couple things. So there's going to be 5 worksheets. We're not doing all those. Those are just there for future reference. We'll do a couple, but not all of them. There's a prompt engineering guide, like some suggestions about how to format prompts, some better or worse ways to think about prompting. So there's that guide. And then there are 2 slide decks. So the first slide deck is this one that we're going to go through now. It's going to have some basic ideas around assessment. So as with the other modules that I was leading, a little bit on the theory kind of side, or like some general concepts, and then working through some activities. So it'll be that same format of a little bit of content, a little bit of activity, that back and forth. The second slide deck is actually more of like 8 different examples for how you might think about using AI in some way with your assessments lesson. So that's going to be that second slide deck. What we'll do is kind of just see how time is going. I think the idea was for us to be finished by 5 o'clock today. So we'll just see how time is moving along and probably make some adjustments. As we go. All right. So that's the plan. That said, welcome to module 8. All right. This is about rethinking assessment in the age of generative AI. Some of the learning objectives are just identifying limitations of traditional assessments. I suspect we don't need to spend too much time on that because you all are already experiencing this in your classes. Then we will try to move to the next bullet point. Okay, so creating AI augmented assessments is how I'm talking about this. Developing some process-oriented approaches to assessments. Implementing rubrics, this is that last part that I mentioned, and then using AI tools to assist with assessment in various ways. All right, so a quick poll to get us started. Which of these is your biggest assessment challenge with AI? All right, so I'll do the same thing as I did yesterday. I'll show those options, and I'll just ask you which of these is the biggest. I'm sure we're all experiencing these in various ways. So I'm just asking which is kind of at the top of your mind. All right, so the first is students use AI but can't explain their work. The second is it's hard to tell what is student versus AI work. Third is that traditional tests don't work anymore. And the fourth is that you don't know how to grade AI collaboration. All right, so those are the 4 options. And as yesterday, I'll just ask you all to raise your hand for, as I go through, for which is the kind of top of your mind, the biggest challenge, all right? So raise your hand if students use AI but can't explain their work, if that's the biggest challenge for you. All right. And then second, it's hard to tell what's student versus AI work. The third is traditional tests don't work anymore. Yeah, yeah. And then the fourth is that you don't know how to grade AI collaboration. All right, cool. Thank you all. All right. So we'll talk about some of the that's funny because there's something under that. Okay. And there's something under that too. Okay. So it's just some foundational ideas. Oh, well, so for the first half of the room, in case you don't know, there's a nice picture of us on the TV back there. Okay, so I'm going to zoom into this. This figure shows up completely in the slide deck, but I'm going to zoom into the slide, into the actual slide in a second. But just for your reference, if you did pull up that PDF, then you would see that figure in an actual more readable format. So that was the reason for including this figure here. But the first, all right. Still a little small for us. All right. It's a little better on those maybe. Okay, so the first of these kind of fundamental ideas or concepts that I wanted to talk about related to assessment is around backward design principles. So briefly, the idea behind backward design when it comes to course design or class design is to start with your learning objectives. Right? So you start with what it is that you want your students to be learning by the end of that class. Then from those learning objectives, you think, okay, what is the assessment? What are the assessments that I need to have that would provide evidence that a student has achieved those learning objectives? Right? So you've gone from learning objectives to the assessments that demonstrate evidence of students achieving those learning objectives. And then with those assessments, you think, okay, what is the content and what is the pedagogy? So what do I need to be teaching and how do I need to be teaching to help students perform well on those assessments to demonstrate that achievement of those learning objectives? So that's in a very short paragraph how backward design is intended. Of course, there are entire papers on this. It's a much larger concept, but that's the core of the idea. Starting with learning objectives, working from objectives to assessments, working from assessments to thinking how you're teaching and what you're teaching. Okay? So that's the first of these ideas. Hopefully, we'll be able to see how those show up in our assessment strategies that we talked about in a few minutes. But just keep that in mind. Now I need to fix this again. Okay. And this diagram is just to show how those chain together. So that's the first kind of like foundational idea. And the second idea is going to be around formative assessment versus summative assessment. So who's heard of these two terms before? The terms are formative assessment and summative assessment, right? So who's heard of that difference? Show hands. All right. Oh, cool. All right, great. So that's, all right, excellent. So the idea behind formative assessment is these are going to be much lower stakes assessments. They're going to be ongoing feedback. So the idea is to have more of these to close feedback loops to students quicker. They tend to be more student-centered, focusing on learning processes. And the kind of phrase that you'll see associated with this is assessment for learning, right? And that's in contrast with summative assessment, which tends to be higher stakes. So you're thinking like final exams, for example, as opposed to maybe homework assignments might be more of the formative assessment. Summative is going to be these final exams, high stakes exams that students are taking. It's also going to be more focused on the product than the process. And this phrase that gets associated with summative assessment would be assessment of learning. So assessment for learning versus assessment of learning is one other way to think about this, right? That is relevant because as we're talking about assessment design, you're always going to want to think, okay, which group does this assessment that I'm thinking about actually belong to or like sort of go with. All right. So again, we don't need to linger on this too much because I know we're all teaching currently and facing these challenges ourselves, but just thinking about what AI can do, as we've been talking about for the last few days, right? Solving complex problems, engaging in some kind of reasoning, whatever that might be, but chaining together steps, generating code and output that you might have previously been expecting your students to generate as evidence of their learning, right? But what we're really trying to assess are kind of more of these deeper kind of critical thinking skills, problem-solving process, and thinking about professional judgment, right? And then the tricky thing, of course, is just how do you actually assess that? So what we're going to talk about is a kind of like three-pillar approach. So it's like the third of these examples of pillars that I'm giving you all, but this is three-pillar approach. So the idea is going to be, and we'll see this explained more in the next slide. So there's just the figure for the slide deck for the PDF, but it's going to be like AI resistant, I'll do this once and then I'll stop doing it. AI resistant assessment. Okay, so every time from now on when I say AI resistant, I'm not going to do the quotes, but just know that's implied. All right, so AI resistant, can't even stop myself. Okay, so AI resistant assessments, AI augmented assessments, and then process oriented assessments. And those second and third are going to sound kind of similar, and I'll try and make a distinction between them when we get there. But the point is, as you're thinking about your assessments, you might want to use this kind of framework to think about where each of your assessments kind of sits. Are you thinking about this more as an AI resistant assessment or more of like an AI augmented assessment and so on? So that's the intention for that kind of framework. All right, so what are these? Or let's talk about these a little bit more. What I'll do is on this slide, have the brief explanation of what each of those means, but then we'll have an example for those in the next few slides, right? So AI resistant assessment is going to be more like what it sounds like. It's intended to be done in something that an AI really can't help the student complete or engage in. That's in contrast with AI augmented assessment, which is very much intended, like you are intending for the student to use AI in some way to complete that assessment. And then the third one is going to be process-oriented assessments, where the objective of that assessment is really to evaluate the process that the student is going through rather than that eventual like final product. Okay, so that's the idea. And this is not intended to be a hierarchy. It's just a framework for thinking where, which combination of these are you trying to use with your assessment? And what I'll suggest is that a combination of those is going to probably be the most effective in your class, right? Do some AI resistant ones, some AI augmented ones, some process oriented ones, right? So just as a quick check to make sure we're following along, wanted to give you all these three different examples. So the first example that is there's assessments on the left column, and then there's those three kinds on the right column. And I'm just asking you all to pair which one goes with which, all right? So that, and just a quick check. So assessment, first one is student explains design decisions in real time. The second assessment is student uses AI to analyze data and then interprets the results. And then the third one is that the student documents their problem-solving process. And what's implied there was, when they were using AI, right? So those are the three options. And I'm just asking you all to pair up A with one of those ones on the right column. Yeah, but sometimes you gotta be like, wait, is that intentional or is that so but yeah, it's also not a trick. Okay, all right. So student explains design decisions in real time is what? Okay, good. And then student uses AI to analyze data and then analyzes or interprets those results. Yeah, augmented, great. And then student documents their problem solving process. Right, good. Okay, good. Right. So it's not tricky, just making sure we're tracking. Okay, excellent. Excellent. Very good, very good. Okay. So now, as I mentioned, we'll go through a couple of examples of each of those and try and unpack it just a little bit more. And then the idea is we'll have an activity after this where there are going to be 9 different examples or like strategies and just as options for you, not options, but maybe opportunities for you to think about which of those might work in your classes. Okay, so that's the idea. But just to unpack these a little bit more. So this first pillar, right, AI resistant assessments, key characteristics, so that's real-time thinking. These are going to be a lot of things that are like in person. Okay, so it's a lot of you asking your students or interacting with your students at that moment. The idea being that they don't really have the option to then consult some sort of AI system. Okay. Some of these will work better than others, especially if you're in like a physical lab setting, right? Those are going to be typically easier to implement because the physical, the physicality of it is going to make it almost by default more AI resistant, at least for now. Okay, so it can also be novel problems that are not in the AI training data. This is a tricky thing, right? So this is like, in theory, sounds nice. In practice, how are you supposed to know what's in distribution and out of distribution, right? But then a lot of this explanation and justification. But again, those explanation and justification, like in real time, like you interacting with your students, face to face. So it's tricky to state the obvious because this is tough to scale, right? So if you're teaching a large introductory course where you have more than 100 students, that's going to be more difficult. If you're in a smaller class, maybe you have 30 students, maybe more of an option, right? You can also do something where you have time-constrained responses. So maybe it's not face-to-face, you asking students to explain themselves. But if you're in class and they don't have devices out, then you can do this same sort of thing, where you're giving them 20 minutes to explain some concept, for example. But again, now if you're in a large classroom, even if you have 100 students, and you can ask them that question all at once, now you have 100 responses to grade. Right, and then there are just some examples here, but those are basically the ones that I already talked through. Right? Here's a more elaborated example. Because we're trying to keep these to 90 minutes and save you all from the 2 hours that this was originally planned for, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is just here for your reference. All right, so this second one is going to be those AI augmented assessments. That's using AI as a learning and professional tool. And this kind of aligns with what I was talking about yesterday. So yesterday when I was standing up here, I was talking about student responsible use of AI and talking about some process-oriented approaches for students documenting their AI use, right? We were talking about metacognition, this idea of having students planning how they're going to use AI and actually using AI and actually evaluating their use of AI. So this is going to align with that, with AI augmented approaches, but also with the process-oriented assessment, right? So here, the key characteristics are going to be trying to kind of explicitly use AI and then have students basically do comparisons. So there was a comparison example yesterday. The idea is give students an AI generated output. They solve the problem themselves. They compare between their approach and the AI approach and identify differences. So that'd be one example. Another example is just giving them the AI approach. You don't ask them necessarily to solve the problem themselves, and now they have to basically act as the critic or like the evaluator of that AI output. So that'd be another example here. You still are asking students to do the process documentation. So that's why it's kind of close to the process-oriented assessments. It's just the process documentation isn't like the main focus in this format. And as I mentioned, that's where you're really trying to critique the AI output, which can be good in the sense that it helps build their in theory, it helps build their critical thinking skills and helps them identify where there are strengths and weaknesses with these AI systems. And that gets, again, to tie this to yesterday, when we were talking about metacognition, there were these two kind of ways or two parts of metacognition. We talked about metacognitive knowledge and metacognitive regulation. The regulation was, the planning, monitoring, and evaluation. But on the metacognitive knowledge side, we talked about task knowledge, and that can kind of come in here where they have knowledge about the task and then the process knowledge. So knowledge about using AI and again, strengths and limitations. All right. So these are some of the examples. The first one was, as I mentioned, sort of like having AI as a collaborator. So you can have students intentionally working with an AI system. In this case, I've been talking about the scenario where you either give students the AI output and they generate it themselves. I also gave the version where students critique the AI output. There's a third version where you sort of flip that. And instead, students generate their output. Then they go to an AI system, have that system critique their output. And then the idea is now you need to have them evaluate the AI critique of their output, right? So it starts to get a little, what would be the phrase? Not redundant, but sort of circular, yeah. So there's that version that you can try. And then there's also students using integrating AI with research projects. This is tricky, again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, and this notion of using AI to help with writing papers, I think was what was discussed earlier, but also finding references, right? Like this is also one of those places where it's, what do you say? A learning opportunity or to help students realize the capacity, the ability of these models to hallucinate and generate fake references, right? All right. So there's some instances of AI augmented assessment. And again, just here's another example that we're not going to spend too much time on. But the one thing I did want to linger on for a second was if you are doing this, then maybe how you alter your grading distribution. It's like how you think about the distribution of the points, right? So some points now go to assessing the process and not just the actual accuracy. So as previously, maybe 5 years ago, you maybe gave students a problem set and you were just grading on, is this answer correct? Maybe you're giving partial credit for seeing if they were working through the problem correctly, but that was basically the essential part of the assessment. And now it's part that, but also you're splitting up some points to actually evaluate the approach they're taking them, right? So that's an example of a distribution that you might think about. All right, and then the third one is going to be process oriented. So now you're trying to help students monitor their own use over time, right? So they're documenting what are they doing, why are they doing it. Again, this is where the self-regulated learning ideas from yesterday are really coming in because you're having them do the planning, do the monitoring, do the evaluation, and then plan for the next cycle. So that's why that becomes more of a longitudinal process. So then you're asking students to use like reflection journals. You're asking students to have more of a sort of ability to track their progress over time. Now, that's maybe for some of us, maybe for most of us, going to be a different kind of assessment than we're used to if we're teaching the typical, stereotypical like fluid dynamics course or thermodynamics course, right? I don't know about your experience, but my experience has been not using reflective journals in that kind of setting. So it's a different kind of assessment, but that's what this would look like. And again, that's an example where some of these may be more or less appropriate for your class. And as I mentioned, this is going to be talking about multiple cycles, with the idea being hopefully you can see some change over time. Not just you see change over time, but of course your students see that change as well. All right. And then just a few examples. So learning portfolios would be one instance. I'm kind of curious because this is like not a very popular thing in at universities in the US, but like does anyone use like learning portfolios or know what those are? A few people. Okay. So the idea is like one of the ideas is helping students like collect evidence of their learning, but through different projects, different assignments, and they basically kind of collect that over time. So here, the same idea, now they're collecting evidence of their AI use and that documentation over time. All right. So again, another example, and what I want to do is get us into that first activity. Okay, so that's fine. All right. So this first activity is going to be for a worksheet 8-1. And what that is like I said earlier, 9 strategies. So 3 strategies for each of those 3 pillars. And the exercise is basically to think which of those strategies, if any, fit in your course or the kinds of classes that you teach. Right? So that's the exercise. Take about 10 minutes and we'll see how we're doing at that point. Right? Questions before we get started? All right. Okay. All right. Thank you all. Okay, so the purpose of that first exercise was really to set you up for this next exercise. This next exercise is really more thinking, all right, so maybe we've thought about some of those different strategies. Maybe we've seen a few examples of what they might look like, right? So maybe some examples of what the kind of AI augmented assessment strategy might look like. Now the idea is to think about in your own class, what is an assessment you could consider redesigning, using one of those strategies. Of course, those aren't necessarily the only strategies. Those are just examples that you might consider. So the idea is with this next worksheet, and as with all the, as with all the worksheets that I've been providing, right? You could say that they are highly structured. Let's be generous. Okay, so that you don't have to go line by line. It's really just to try and provide the structure if you need it. But the exercise is about, all right, which of my assessments might I want to try to modify or change in some way using one of these strategies? That's really the exercise. So this is worksheet 8-2, and we'll try and spend around 15 minutes doing that. And then we're actually going to leave this slide deck and hop into for the last 30 or 35 minutes. We'll hop into some other examples of using AI to help with other parts of assessment, right? So that's the plan basically for the next 50 minutes or so. But first, we'll start with worksheet 8-2. Okay? All right. Well, All right, thank you all. All right, so we have about 35 minutes left. What I wanted to do was something slightly changed, like changed up the pace a little bit. So it sounded like yesterday, toward the end of the day, that we gotten some feedback, maybe like some more hands-on, but maybe more like interacting with language models activities might be helpful. And so that's how, this morning with Bailey, for example, like there was some of that activity. So that's the idea for the next part that we're going to do, and for why there's like this part 2 of the slide deck that I'm now going to jump to. So the remainder of this part 1 slide deck is around like rubrics and rubric design. So if you are interested in creating a rubric, so some sort of guideline for how you're going to evaluate student process, for example, like that information is in the remainder of this slide deck, and then also in one of the worksheets. So that information is there. But what I'm going to do is go to the front, pull up this part 2 slide deck. I want to go through the slides relatively quickly because there's an activity that is basically taking those 8 examples that are in the slides and then asking you all to try them out yourselves. So that's where you all are going to pull up a language model or 2 of your choice and try out a few of these yourselves. So that's the plan basically for the remainder of today. We'll also spend a couple minutes going over, or at least going through quickly, the prompt engineering guide. I kind of had the impression that maybe some people had already had a chance to pull that up and look at it, because Mitch was able to go around earlier and make sure people saw that. So I just wanted to maybe touch on a few of the highlights from that, and then we'll call it a day when we get to 5 o'clock, right? So that's the plan. I'm going to switch slide decks now, and then we'll pick up again, right? So this is, again, in that shared drive, it's just part 2. And these really are just examples. There's okay, so there's a QR code, that's fine. There's some motivation here, but these slides, basically, the remainder of these slides all are going to look the same. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to like flip through 2 slides quickly so you know what the format is, and then we'll actually go through these examples. All right, so the format is there are 8 examples. Each example has 2 slides associated with it. The first one basically describes how you might consider using AI in some way to help with some part of assessment. So it's kind of describing the challenge, how you might use AI, and then why that might be a good way to use AI. And keep in mind, like, these are not going to be all applicable to your course. The goal is to have 1 or 2 things that you might find useful. Okay, so anyways, first slide is just the challenge, the approach, why that might be a good idea. And then the second slide, we can get to it. Okay, so I'm hitting this. You can hear me hitting. Okay, thank you. So okay, so the problem is that why is there? Okay, so what happens, in case anyone thought I was crazy, is I was like looking at that screen and not seeing it change because it's still stuck on 1. Okay, well, that's awesome. Okay, so second slide is basically like showing a very basic prompt if you were going to try to do this, and then a more improved prompt. And again, like, these are all in that slide deck, so hopefully it's easier for you to read there in that PDF. But the basic prompt, the improved version, why that might be an improved prompt, because as you know, right, it's a lot of how good the quality of the output is from the language model is going to be somewhat dependent on the quality of the input, so how good your prompt is, which is why there's also that prompt guide that we'll talk about in a second. All right, so anyways, this first example is around, okay, that's the format of the slides, right? 2 slides for each example. First slide, approach, why. Second one is the actual example, and then just go through. Right? So this first use of AI was around streamlining peer feedback. So this is something that we've done in our classes. Who here teaches courses where you have students working in teams? So show of hands if you have students working in teams in your class in some way. Right. So in our first year engineering courses, they're project-based courses at my university, and we have students working in small teams throughout the year. And as part of that process, students will write each other feedback. This is what I was telling you about earlier. Okay, so students will write each other feedback, and that is intended for two things. One, to help the instructor know how well students are working, but then two, ideally, to give students feedback about, from their teammates. And if you've ever worked with undergraduate student or grad students, or just people, sometimes that feedback is a little, harsh, a little rude, maybe not something that you want to be giving directly to your students. So for example, let's say the five of us up front here are in a class, and now, my four teammates are giving me feedback. Ideally, you'd be able to give that feedback, their feedback to me, but maybe one of them is not the most polite. And so, you want to sort of help make that a little bit more digestible or easier for me to read, let's say. Right? So the idea is, okay, well, what we've done is basically have an AI, like a language model, take that feedback, then take and identify the positive parts that my teammates said to me, identify the negative parts, make it a little more constructive, let's say. So what I get back at the end of that is a report that says, here are the positive things, here are the areas for improvement, and more importantly, here's how you can improve. So it's basically treated as some way to give me feedback so I can improve my teamwork skills. Then the other thing to do is for my teammates who wrote that feedback, maybe somebody did not write the most helpful feedback. So then also give that student feedback about how to improve their communication skills. So the idea is that you can help students with their teamwork skills and their communication skills. And that's just one way for thinking about how to use AI. In this case, it's kind of like in the area of teamwork assessment, but that's what this is about. So that's streamlining peer feedback synthesis. All right. So this second one is AI as a critical friend. And now we'll go a little quicker. So this is AI as a critical friend for like rubric refinement. So let's say you want to generate a rubric to use in your course to evaluate students' use of AI. And the idea is, I usually have a tough time generating a rubric that is great for like a version 1. Usually that first version has some ambiguity, right? It's not very clear what these terms mean. So the idea is to use this, use AI to basically get feedback on the quality of your rubric. That's what that critical friend means there. And then there's the example for the prompt. The reason I'm going to go through these is because the whole activity is for you all to then have that worksheet that has these outlined for you all to then think, all right, like, how could I adopt this in my class, or adopt one of these in my class? Right. So this third one is test driving assignments with AI. So that really is you thinking, all right, I want to see how a student might interpret this assignment. So you prompt the language model to act as if they're an undergraduate student or a student in your course. You give them parts of that assignment and you see, okay, what's the kind of output you might expect to receive back? So that's what that test driving is about. This fourth one is about aligning outcomes, like assessments with outcomes and taxonomies. So thinking about the backward design principles, right? You start with your objectives, then you go work with your assessments, and then you work with how you're teaching and what you're teaching. So this is about connecting the objectives with those assessments. The idea being, maybe this helps you, again, with that critical friend for saying, I'm trying to assess this objective with this assessment. What are ways for me to make that alignment better? Right. This fifth one is around generating example answers, or like model answers. So again, if you're in a course, this usually happens in like design courses where students are generating reports, or like lab courses where students are generating reports that they're turning in. So when you do that, sometimes especially if it's at the beginning of the semester where students are still trying to figure out what's expected of them. They'll ask for, it can be helpful to give them examples like, this is the kind of output that I'm expecting you all to turn in for this report or for this assignment. And sometimes you've taught this course previously, so you can ask your prior students, hey, can I use this as an example to provide to future students of what a good assignment looks like. But sometimes maybe it's your first time teaching it, or maybe sometimes you don't have those students to ask for a good example, or maybe it's a new assignment, right? So the idea here is to use AI to help you generate examples of good and less good responses, so that you can then provide those to your students as examples like, hey, this is the kind of thing I'm looking for, this is what I'm not looking for. Again, in theory, you could do this yourself, but the idea is to try and help expedite that process a little bit. Fifth example is going to be around, very good. So developing complex scenarios and case studies. So as I mentioned yesterday, like in the area of like ethics education, sometimes there are good case studies that you can use to show your students, right? There are, if you go online, you're looking for different cases, there are like banks of these case studies that exist, but sometimes they're fairly outdated or they don't really apply to the context that you're working in. And so working with a language model to generate those case studies can be another way to do that. And that would be in the case where you're trying to assess, ethical judgments or ethical sensitivity or things like that. All right, this next one, generating responses for students to critique. So this is very much what we've already been talking about with that sort of AI augmented process and the comparative analysis. So we can move on from that. And then this last one is just going to be adapting and differentiating assessment items. So let's say you have one question that you think, yeah, this is a good thing, but I've used this the past 3 years. So how can I modify it in some ways? And the idea is to try and have a language model basically help you generate new ideas for ways to modify that assessment. So for example, we have an assessment that we use for assessing student systems thinking. So the idea is you give students like an ill-structured problem, so a problem that's fairly underspecified. Like you give them some details, but not a lot of details. The one that we have comes up with a fake town that's going into a harsh winter and they're facing an energy shortage. And then you ask students to identify stakeholders, identify potential problems, identify additional information that they need. So you ask students these series of questions. But again, that's all centered around like an energy shortage. And then the idea is, okay, but if I wanted to adopt this or adapt this, or maybe a food shortage or a water shortage or some other sort of situation, I have the same general setup. Then we go to a language model and say, all right, like here's the current version of the assessment. I'd like to change it, for this context. Help me update it in that way. So that's what that would be an example of that version, right? So those are those 8. What I want to do is scroll through that prompt guide just to orient you a little bit, but then have you basically spend the last portion of today working through that last worksheet, which I think is 8-5. I'll make sure about that. Yeah. So it's 8-5 is that last worksheet for today. But as I mentioned before, the thing I wanted to do before getting there, very good. The thing I wanted to do before getting there is just to make sure we talk about a few general principles for you when it comes to prompt engineering, all right? And these are all outlined in that document. So what you have here is these core principles at the beginning. So, being specific and detailed, providing context. So that's even part of that trace framework from yesterday. That was that C, thinking about the context that the language model has. Defining your desired output and like desired output format specifically. So what exactly are you looking for the model to give you back? Requesting multiple perspectives can also be a one thing. And then the last one was just including some sort of quality criteria, right? So Mitch also included this 4W prompt, right? And so there's an example. See, well, you're not going to be able to see it all on one screen, but this is also an example of not only having, why is it doing that? Okay, so not only having the like a good structure, but also talking about the like different sections. And you can see how there's these different sections that are marked as it's going along. It's also giving the model like what exactly are the steps you're asking it to do. There are these prompt principles here that you might want to reference. And then finally, just some more templates or examples, right? So that's what's in that prompt engineering guide document. And then you might want to use some of those again for this activity for 8-5, right? But as I mentioned, it's around 4:40 now. We'll spend the rest of today working on this worksheet, or as I said yesterday, I'm not going to know the difference. So if you find something else that's more productive or useful for you to work on, you don't have to work on this specific worksheet. Right?
informação. Os importantes sobre amanhã, a maioria vai pegar poucos dados depois do almoço. Então, eu falei com a Tainari, com o pessoal que cuida aqui do espaço, para que vocês possam trazer suas malas, deixar nessa sala de apoio aqui do lado, tá? E, ok. Beleza? Daí aquela senhora que tem a chave, ela falou que vai trancar a sala para nós podermos ir almoçar e depois pegarmos as malas e irmos para o aeroporto. Tá bom? Era o único recado que eu precisava dar para vocês, tá?
Obrigado. Obrigado.